now that we have a really good understanding of how the module system in JavaScript is implemented in React, and the fact that we're going to use JavaScript modules for each of our React components, now we're going to go through the process of creating a React functional component and make sure that it is in its own module and show how we might import that module and use it within our app module. And showing how the app module becomes the parent or the orchestrating component, and how our component becomes a child component of this parent component. Let's go ahead and get started with that. Now, because the module system is all about better organization of our code and making our code base more reusable, and of course addressing that separation of concerns and the do not repeat yourself strategies, we're going to go ahead and first things first, in our source folder over here, we are going to go ahead and create a new folder, and we are going to name it Components. And this is where we're going to start to build out all of our components that make up our React application as we learn about React. Now, inside of our components, we're going to go ahead and create another folder, and I'm going to call this To-Do Item. And I'm going to use underscores because I prefer that over camel case. So To-Do Item. And it is inside of this To-Do Item folder that I am going to create my first React component. And because we are going to be dealing with displaying a to-do item to start out with, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it a functional component. Because remember, we told ourselves we need to ask ourselves these questions to determine whether or not our component would be functional or else be a class-based component. And here, if we ask ourselves about a to-do item display, or the component that displays a to-do item, and we ask ourselves these questions, will it okay, so usually used to simply display data or capture data from the user. So if we're doing the display component for a to-do item, obviously we're just displaying data. We're not creating data, we're not updating data, we're not deleting data, we're simply displaying it. So the answer is yes to this one. We're simply going to display data. Next thing is, do we need to know about the life cycle of the component? Being that we're just displaying data, we don't need to know when it's created or when the component's updated or when it's deleted. So the answer is yes to this. It does not need to know about that. And then will it create or manage data of its own? Now, what I mean by of its own is, will it be creating that data and managing that data, and that data belongs to that particular component? In this case, the to-do item would most likely be coming from our orchestrating component as part of a list of to-do items that were pulled down and downloaded to our application, probably by our app component. And then as we go to render our list, an individual to-do item would actually probably be passed that item to this component to render that single item. So for this, the answer is also yes, it doesn't need to manage or create its own data. So we would then go ahead and say that this display component for a to-do item is definitely going to be a functional component. So following the method that we have right here inside of the default app functional component, we're going to mimic this and we're going to create a to-do item. Now, being that we don't have a backend set up for this, we're just going to be using dummy data in order to do this. So let's start out with a set of dummy to-do items that we will be using within our app just as placeholders while we wait to create the backend. So let's go ahead and right here, actually let's leave our comments right there. And above this, I'm going to go ahead and put a note that we are building some dummy data here. That way we know exactly that this is dummy data and it should be removed. So we're going to go ahead and put a note here that it should be deleted after the backend is created. And then we're just going to do a const because we don't, well, we might be altering that data. So let's just do let, and then we're going to do let to do items equal, and then we're going to have an array of to do items. And let's come up with our data model for to do item. Our to do item is most likely going to have some form of an ID in order to uniquely identify it. And to keep things simple, maybe we'll just use numbers. And then it's going to have a name. So, and we'll just keep it simple. To do item 1. And it probably has a description attribute. Just put some dummy data in here. And then it might have a date that it was created, but I don't want to mess with dates right now. So let's just go ahead and keep it that simple. And then we're going to go ahead and repeat this a couple times. So we have a couple of to-do items that we can use to render a list of to-do items. So let's update this so that we have unique keys for all of our to-do items. Let's update the names just so we know which to-do item we're messing with. Right. So now we've got some dummy data called to-do items. We've got our app right here. And so what we can do is we can talk about our to-do item display component and how we're going to use this data each time that component gets passed a to-do item. And let's begin by creating the files we're going to need. So we're going to do a new file, and here we're going to call it to-do item display. And I'm going to be very specific just so I know what each of these components do. And it will need a JavaScript file, and then like our other applications, it might need a CSS, but we'll cover CSS later, or styling of a component specifically. So let's start out with just the JavaScript we're going to need. Now, just like our app.js, we need to make sure that we import our React library, because that's the library that provides us all of the functionality we need for React. So we'll go ahead and import that, and then down here you'll see it's just a JavaScript function. And well, you can see that it's actually a constructor function because we're using a capital on the name of the function. And then it simply returns a block. And then we do our export default. So let's go ahead and create our function. And we're going to name it just like we did our file, except for, of course, it's going to be a to-do item display. And it's just a function. And in this function, we are going to return a block of JSX. Now we haven't decided what that JSX looks like yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and have that block right there. Now, every component has to have a root piece of JSX, so it has to have a single JSX element that is the root of it, and that's kind of based off of HTML. HTML, you have the body tag, which is the root of the body of your HTML document, or you have the HTML, which is the root tag of your document. And then for everything that's displayed in the browser, the body is the root tag of it. And that's kind of what I was getting at. So let's go ahead and just use a div, and then we'll just go ahead and, just so we can identify it, we'll just give it a class name. And of course that relates to a CSS class. And we'll go ahead and give it the name of a to-do item. To-do item display. And that, of course, would end up being our CSS for it. Now, for right now, let's just go ahead and put some text in here, just so we know that this is being displayed when we import it into our app. And then we're just going to run it and see it work without inputting data in it yet. So this is a to-do item display. All right. And then, just like in our app.js, we need to export default the app as the default object that comes back from our module. So we'll do our export. Now let's look at this again. It's export default. and then we're going to do the to-do item display as the default export for this module. And with that, we have a completed functional component that is a module of its own so that we can reuse it wherever we need it. Now, just so we can see how this works, let's go back to our app.js and let's kind of get rid of this default stuff that we have in our app.js. And you'll notice if we reopen up our terminal, we look at our output. Oh, do we not have our app running? Looks like we may not have our app running. So let's go ahead and do npm start. Get our app running. Gonna wait for it to run. Oh, it looks like we have a version of this already running. Let's go ahead and choose no. And then, do we have it running in our terminal? Nope. That means we already have it running inside of our application here. So let's see if we can open up our terminal. Let's see, show running tasks. npm start is running, so we'll click on that. And here we can see that it's running right here. All right, and then every time we change our application, you will see that it will recompile in order to make sure that our application has the latest and greatest. And because we removed all of that content we had inside of the app, you'll see we just simply have a blank page right now. And you'll notice that down here we get warnings and errors in our console showing that the logo was imported but was never used, and then our to-do items was created but never used. So let's go ahead and get rid of this logo because we're not going to use the React logo in our app. Go ahead and save that, and you can see it just recompiled. All right. Now our to-do item display component is a functioning component, even though it's not very complex, and we can actually pull that in right here into our application. But to do that, first we have to import all of our components. So I'm going to go ahead and put a note right here just so that we know that right here is where we're importing components. And these are our local application components, not components from third parties or components from React. So we'll do an import, and then we're going to import the to-do item display component, and then we're going to do that from, oops, I started to use Node.js, from, and then we're going to pull it from our local application. So we use the // go to components, then we're going to go to to-do item, and then we are going to pull in the JavaScript file for our to-do item display. Add our semicolon so that we've got well-formatted JavaScript. And now we have a to-do item display. So ignoring our to-do item list right here, we're not going to use that yet. Let's just show that we have successfully imported a to-do item from our local components. And then we're going to go ahead and show how we might import that component and then display it in our application. Now, in React, when we pull in or import a component and we provide that name, really what we're pulling in is a constructor function that allows us to create multiple instances of our React component. In other words, we're not pulling in just a single instance of this to-do item. We're actually pulling in a constructor function that allows us to create multiple instances of this component and use it as many times as we want inside of our application. And we'll see how to do that in a minute when we iterate over this array and then we begin to add to-do items. Right now we're just going to stick with the simple ability of using JSX to import, or not to import, but to use that to-do item display inside of our application. And here I'm going to use a self-closing JSX tag, which is very similar to a self-closing HTML tag. And we are actually going to use this constructor function right here. And what this tells React is that when we go to execute this component, go ahead and create a new version of that component and then embed its JSX inside of the JSX for our app. So when we click save on that, we'll see our React component, our React application just got recompiled. We'll come in here. We can see this is a to-do item inside of our HTML. And if we go ahead and inspect that, let's open this up so we can see it a little bit better. You can see that we still have that root element, which came from our index.html. And then our index.js went and plugged our app React component into that root HTML element. And then inside of our app.js, when it got rendered, we then inserted a new to-do item display component into it. And you can see that right here. We've got a to-do item display component, which really is just a div with some text that we've manually put in there. And here you can see that right here, to-do item display. And this is a to-do item display. And we get that inside of our HTML already embedded and ready to go. So that is creating a functional component, exporting the functional component as a module, and then importing that component for use inside of our application using the import feature of our React application, and then importing that module, and then using that React component which came out of that module inside of the JSX of the parent component. So now what we have is we have a parent component which now has a child component which is a to-do item display. And that same hierarchy follows through in the HTML that gets generated as a result of that parent-child relationship. In the next video, what we're going to focus on is the React virtual DOM, which is what helps us with all of this when we are creating and updating and managing components inside of our HTML page, and making sure that all of this management of components that happens within a single HTML page, make sure that it's effective, fast, and works really well. And we're going to go ahead and move on to that now.